Good to see you guys. We are in the book of 2 Chronicles. We're picking up in chapter 8. We come to the end of Solomon's life. Chapter 8 and chapter 9 kind of conclude the life of Solomon, and then we begin the rest of the kings of Judah. And it's an incredible history that we're going to be looking at. Solomon had just completed his greatest accomplishment, this building of the temple that he had undergone. It had taken years and years for the temple to be completed. And Israel had become the greatest nation in the world under King David's reign and then now King Solomon's reign. It's amazing because all of it was a fulfillment of God's promises to the nation of Israel. You see, way back when God had taken Israel out of Egypt, he had spoke to Moses and he told him there's some blessings that come with obeying me and following me and seeking after me with all of your heart. In the book of Deuteronomy chapter 8, let's check this out. Deuteronomy chapter 8. I'm sorry, chapter 28. I was going, that's the wrong chapter. Chapter 28. Chapter 27 is when Moses went up on the mountain and received the 10 Commandments written with God's finger on stone, if you remember that. And then chapter 28, God's telling him, look, if you'll just follow those things that I've commanded you, if you just obey the things that I've instructed you, here's what will happen. And look how he declares it in chapter 28. Watch this. It came to pass, or it shall come to pass, if you diligently obey the voice of the Lord your God, to observe carefully all of his commandments, which I command you today, that the Lord your God will set you high above all nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, because you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall be the fruit of your body, the produce of your ground, and the increase of your herds, the increase of your cattle, and the offspring of your flocks. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed shall you be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. The Lord will cause your enemies who rise against you to be defeated before your face. They shall come out against you one way and flee before you 7 ways. The Lord will command the blessing on your storehouse and on all to which you set your hand. He will bless you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. The Lord will establish you as a holy people to himself, just as he has sworn to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in his ways. And all the people of the earth shall see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they shall be afraid of you. The Lord will grant you plenty of goods, and the fruit of your body, and the increase of your livestock, and the produce of your ground. The land which the Lord your swore to your fathers to give you. Check this out. The Lord will open to you his good treasures, the heavens, to give the rain to you and your land in its season, to bless the work of your hand. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. The Lord will make you the head and not the tail. You shall be above only and not beneath, if you heed the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and are careful to observe them, so you shall not turn from any of the words which I command you this day to the right or to the left, to go after other gods to serve them. Man, what a list of blessings. Right? He goes, I'm going to open up the heavens. I'm going to give you everything you need in abundance. I'm going to blow your mind if you'll just follow after me with all of your heart. Obey the things that I command you to. And what's incredible is as you look at this particular passage tonight is Israel is finally in that place where God promised them they would be if they would obey him. And I think for you and I, guys, it's, that same principle. Now God's not promised we're going to be, gold like Solomon or silver like Solomon. He's telling us, look, I will blow your mind. I will bless you more than you can even imagine if you'll just put your life in my hands, if you'll just follow the things I declare. God's desire for us is that we be blessed. But that comes with obedience. That comes with us surrendering our hearts, our minds to God, saying, God, I want to follow your path, your ways, the things you declare. And it's amazing because open up now to 2 Chronicles chapter 8. Check this out. It came to pass at the end of 20 years, when Solomon had built the house of the Lord and his own house, that the cities which Hiram had given to Solomon, Solomon built them, and he settled the children of Israel there. Now, Solomon for 20 years had been building God's house and his own house. And he comes to the end of that. And now he's going to begin to expand outside of Jerusalem. These cities that had been given to him by King Hiram. King Hiram was the king of Tyre. He had great respect for King David, his dad, and now King Solomon, also had favor with King Hiram. And he's, saying, hey, here's a city for you. Here's some land for you. Why don't you go and, expand your borders? And Solomon now is building out these other cities. Not just Jerusalem, but now he's expanding the nation. He says in verse 3 that as Solomon went to Hamath Zobah and he seized it. Now, this is the only battle that Solomon has. It's the only one recorded. All the rest of it had already been defeated by David, and it seems as though there was one particular land that he now goes and he seizes. And then in verse 4, he built Tadmor in the wilderness and all the storage cities which he built in Hamath. He built Upper Beth Horon and Lower Beth Horon, fortified cities with walls and gates and bars. Also Belath and all the storage cities that Solomon had, and all the chariot cities and the cities of the Calvary, and all of this that Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem and Lebanon and all the land of his dominion. Now, Israel had spread out. It wasn't just the city now. He was taking territory. We're going to find out all the way from Egypt, all the way up to Lebanon, all the way up to Damascus. That whole region now was under Solomon's control. And there was a reason for all of this. It was because God wanted Israel to be a light to the nations. His desire is that all of the nations would come into Israel to learn about the God of Israel. They were to be the light that was on a hill. It was to be the place where everyone goes, man, this is what the blessings of God looks like when you follow him, when you seek after him. This beautiful temple, this worship of God that was taking place. Remember back in chapter 7, it says when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven, consumed the burnt offerings, the sacrifice, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So you have this incredible, just presence of God. You have, this city that's being expanded, this nation that's being expanded, just God's blessings pouring out upon that community and that nation. And all of Israel, is understanding something, that when God is honored, when God is lifted up, when God is in the right place, that, there's benefits to it for us. It's God's blessings come with it. Now, in verse 7, he says, all the people who are left of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, who were not of Israel, that is, their descendants who were left in the land after them, whom the children of Israel did not destroy, these Solomon raised forced labor as it is to this day, and Solomon did not take the children of Israel servants for his work. Some were men of war, captains of officers, captains of chariots, and his cavalry. Now, these guys were under forced slavery. Kind of, well, what's up with that, right? Now, he's just stating the fact. But the reality is that God wanted the nation of Israel to declare that, he was the one who was the head, not the tail. That they were the ones who were lending, not borrowing. That they were in control because God was their God. I love the Psalm 33:12. It says this: blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he has chosen as his own inheritance. Blessed is the nation that is a nation whose God is the Lord. Capital L, capital O, capital R, capital D. That's Jehovah God. That's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You see, he wanted them to understand that when he's at the head of that nation, that nation would prosper. That nation would be blessed. As I'm convinced that the reason our nation has been blessed is because we were a nation at one point who feared God, who had the foundation of Judeo-Christian principles. The whole Constitution was based upon, the biblical concepts and biblical precepts. And it's amazing because, when God's at the head of that nation, God blesses that nation. See, I've traveled all around the world, and I tell you what, every time I come home, I kiss the ground. Because you realize how blessed we really are. You realize that we have been above measure blessed. And I'm convinced, I'm with all of my heart, that the reason is because our founding fathers had faith. They had biblical principles at their heart. And so it's an amazing picture here because, all these other nations are coming, are there and they're there serving God's people. And then check this out. Verse 11. Now Solomon brought the daughter of Pharaoh up from the city of David to the house he had built for her. For he said, my wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places to which the ark of the Lord has come are holy. Now, it's interesting that Solomon kind of unveils that there's a chink in his armor. Solomon was aware that the temple was holy, that the house that he had built, which was right adjacent to the temple, was holy ground. And he had brought a wife from Egypt and moved her into his house. And he said, you know what, I got to move her out. He didn't divorce her. He didn't get rid of her. He said, I'm just going to move her to another location because I'm on holy ground here. And one of the things you're going to find is that Solomon begins to accumulate wives. Now, Chronicles doesn't get into that detail. 2 Kings does. And what's amazing is that you start to see that Solomon slowly is beginning to compromise. He didn't just have one wife. No, that wasn't good enough for Solomon. He had 300 of them. 700 concubines, though those are his chicks on the side. This guy had no limits. And it's amazing because, here he's aware. And I think one of the things that kind of really struck me here is that Solomon knew that having Pharaoh's daughter in that house was wrong. And so he thought, I'll just kind of build her another house. I'll get her outside of Jerusalem. I'll get her away from the temple. And it seems to be the beginning of his demise. He just compromised in one area. Let me tell you something. It's easier to compromise in the next area. You compromise in the next area, it becomes easier to compromise in the next area. And it's just like a snowball. Once that conviction, you know what truth is, and you don't want to obey the truth, what happens is that it's not long before you're willing to compromise in other arenas. You see, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, remember, we went back to the blessings back in chapter 28. In chapter 17 of Deuteronomy, when Moses was receiving the commandments and the laws and the precepts that were to guide the nation of Israel, this is what God had told Moses. When you guys have a king, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. We'll see that in the next chapter. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself. Check this out. Lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver or gold for himself. Also it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself a copy of the law in a book from the one that is before the priests, the Levites. You see, Solomon was required to take the first 5 books of Moses, and he was to copy them and have a book for himself from his own writing, from his own hand, so that every word in that book had been something that not only he read, but he had also written out. It's one thing to say, well, I don't remember that thing. No, you wrote it. You wrote every verse, you wrote every chapter, you wrote every book concerning the law of God. So there's no excuse that you didn't know it. And it seems that here Solomon is going, man, I know that this is wrong, but I'll just kind of hide it. I'll just kind of move it out of the way. And what that does is you give the enemy a foothold. You begin to give him opportunity, and his heart begins to turn away from the Lord. And it happens in Solomon's life, but it also happens in our lives. Once we begin this road of compromise, once we start to like, well, it's not, that big a deal. I'll just do it, so no one sees it. I'll just kind of hide it from everybody else. And you just begin to compromise there, and then, it just gains speed. It just continues to grow. It's like cancer. Sin is like cancer. It spreads. Matter of fact, Paul used that analogy. He says a little bit of leaven leavens the whole lump. Once you put a little bit of leaven in a ball of dough, that leaven just permeates the whole ball, and pretty soon it rises. And that's the picture. As Solomon here, aware that he was doing something wrong, and now he's going to try to cover it up. He's going to kind of move it out of the forefront and kind of put it on the side. And then we're told in verse 12. Now, and this is interesting in verse 12. Solomon offered burnt offerings to the Lord on the altar of the Lord, which he had built before the vegetables, according to the daily rate, offering according to the commandments of Moses, the Sabbaths, the new moons, the 3 appointed yearly feasts, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Tabernacles. And according to the order of David, his father, he appointed the divisions of the priests for their service, the Levites for their duties, to praise and to serve before the priests as the duty of each day required. The gatekeepers by their division at each gate. For so David, the man of God, had commanded. They did not depart from the command of the king to the priests and the Levites concerning any matter or concerning the treasuries. all the work of Solomon was well ordered from the day of the foundation of the house of the Lord until it was finished. So the house of the Lord was completed. And Solomon on the outward was being very thorough, very complete. He was doing everything right on the appearance of things. And he was establishing the nation as a nation where God dwelt, where God's presence was. It's an amazing picture because for the first time, all the land that was given to Israel is in Israel's hand. From the time of Joshua, God had laid out, every tribe was to have a particular piece of property, and all of them were to conquer the enemy in that kind. This is the first time recorded that all of the enemies of Israel are defeated, and Israel has possession of all the land that was given to them. And it's incredible because, you see what happens when a nation puts God first. But it just takes, a little bit of compromise to begin to deteriorate. By the time we get to his son Rehoboam, the tribes are divided. 2 tribes against the 10 tribes, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Now they have separate kings. Because that leaven had been, introduced into the lump, and it was causing, division and conflict. We'll see Rehoboam next week. We'll begin to look at the life of Solomon's son Rehoboam. But here's Israel at their greatest moment, at the height of their existence. They're experiencing God's favor, God's blessing. Notice there in verse 17, Solomon went to Ezion-Geber and Elath on the seacoast in the land of Edom, and Hiram sent him ships by the hands of his servants who knew the sea. They went with the servants of Solomon to Ophir and acquired 450 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. I mean, just think about the amount of wealth, the amount of just prosperity that was taking place in the land. And what was happening is that it was beginning to be known throughout the known world of that day. As we begin chapter 9, we find a very familiar story. If you read of the scriptures, there was a woman who is known as the Queen of Sheba. Movies written, about the Queen of Sheba and Solomon's life, and some of the extra biblical accounts saying that her and Solomon bore a child together. The scripture doesn't tell us that. That's just some assumptions, I think, that were made. But the Queen of Sheba journeyed to Jerusalem because of the fame of Solomon. She came from a far country. Now, there's a lot of debate. Where's Sheba and how far of journey that was? We really don't have any other details on the location of Sheba or what her some believe she was from Ethiopia. There's others who have different opinions of that. But what's interesting, Jesus makes reference to her. And if Jesus makes reference to her, then I'm going to say she was probably a woman who came from a far country. That's what Jesus says, the queen of the south shall arise in judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them, for she came from the uttermost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. That's pretty cool. Jesus goes, you know what? I'm going to give you guys a little history lesson just to validate what happened in that day. She came from a far country. She came from a far distance. And notice what it says here in verse 9. Now, when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test Solomon with hard questions. Having a very great retinue of camels that bore spices, gold in abundance, and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. She gets a personal audience with King Solomon. She comes with an entourage. She had brought camels, and she had brought all of these spices and gold. And they, in that day, you just, when you traveled, you just didn't jump on a plane. A 4-hour flight or a 10-hour flight or a 15-hour flight. No, this would have been months on the road. Dangerous territory. It would have been, something that would have been, a very big journey and inconvenience. And Sheba says, I got to go find out for myself. I want to know what is this Solomon? What's going on in Jerusalem? What is this guy declaring? As everyone's talking about the wisdom he possesses, she makes her journey there, and she begins to sit with Solomon. And it says that she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. I would imagine she was asking all the big questions of life. How did we get here? Who created us? Why am I here? Where am I going? Right? I mean, I would imagine that if you have the opportunity to talk to someone who's got answers, you're going to ask the questions that you've been hiding in your heart your whole life. And Solomon's sitting there explaining to her how God is the creator of heaven and earth, and telling her how God has a purpose for her life. And it just begin, question by question, he begins to give her answers and reasons. He begins to explain to her the worship of the Lord, and then taking her into the temple, and how all these sacrifices are taking place, and the burnt offerings and the holiest of holies, and just all of the details of what God had shown Solomon. And it tells us there in verse 2, so Solomon answered all of her questions. There was nothing so difficult for Solomon that he could not explain it to her. That's a pretty bold statement, isn't it? Every question she had, Solomon had an answer for. And he just didn't have an answer. He gave her the explanation of why. Because you know what's so incredible about God's word is that any issue you're going to face in life, God has the answers for. You got to search them out. You got to seek them. You have to be diligent. But there's answers to your questions, just like Solomon was able to, just give her all the answers to her questions. And it's amazing because at the end of it, she came to some conclusions. Look at verse 3. When the queen of Sheba had seen the wisdom of Solomon and the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers and their apparel, and his entryway by which he went up into the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. What's he saying? He goes, you know what? She was just flabbergasted. She was just in awe. She couldn't even wrap her mind around everything that was going on in Jerusalem, and the worship of God, and the wisdom that Solomon declared. And she was just sitting there, just blown away by God's favor upon the nation and this man that God had given wisdom and knowledge to. And I honestly believe that this was God, fulfilling the promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the promise to Moses that he would do what he promised he would do, that he would make Israel a great nation, that they would have evidence that what God says he does. And it's there in verse 5 where she responds. She said to the king, "It was true. It was a true report which I heard in my own land about the words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe their words until I came and I saw with my own eyes. And indeed, the half of the greatness of your wisdom was not told to me. You exceed the fame in which I heard." Well, what a conclusion, huh? She goes, I didn't even comprehend, as others were telling me of the wisdom that you possess, the things that God was doing in Jerusalem, the house that you had built, the worship of God, the enormity of this kingdom that you had established. And she says in verse 7, "Happy are your men, and happy are these your servants who stand continually before you and hear your wisdom." She goes, man, you guys are blessed beyond measure. That you have this whole thing going on, right? God's presence, God's blessings, the wisdom that God provides. And God's able to provide wisdom to us. I like how James said, he says, if anyone's lacking wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to those who ask him. You want wisdom? And sit at the feet of Jesus and just, God, give me wisdom. The situation I'm in, the answers I need, the decisions I got to make. God, I need you to give me clarity in these things. And when you seek him with all your heart, this is what I know for a fact, God will answer. God will open the doors. God will make clarity for you. And Solomon, blessed with wisdom beyond measure, she's just standing back going, how blessed are you guys that you have all of this, that you got God's presence with you, you got God's wisdom with you. Look at verse 8. "Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on this throne to be king for the Lord your God, because your God has loved Israel to establish them forever. Therefore he made you king over them to do justice and righteousness." Now, she understood. And I think the only reason she understood is because Solomon had declared to her, you know what, this isn't me. This isn't what I have. It's what God gave me. I asked him for the wisdom and he provided it to me. This isn't anything that I, just summed up, or anything that I had done in my own wisdom or my own power. This was God providing me the wisdom. And she acknowledged that, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you." This was all God thing. This is all God's doing. He delighted in you, and he's given you the wisdom that you have, because God loved Israel, because God wanted to do a work. God wanted to proclaim his glory to the nations. Verse 9, it says, "And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great abundance, precious stones. There never was any spices such as those the queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. All the servants of Hiram and the servants of Solomon who brought gold from Ophir brought algum wood and precious stones. And the king made walkways of the algum wood for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, harps and stringed instruments for singers. And there were none such as these seen before in the land of Judah. Now King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all she desired, whatever she asked, much more than she had brought to the king. So she returned and went to her own country, she and her servants. Now, the Queen of Sheba, thinking she was going to come and bless Solomon, right? She brought all the gold and the spices and, all of these gifts. And she's like, man, I can't even believe I get to be in your presence and hear the wisdom and see what God has done and see what God is doing. And it says King Solomon gave her more than she gave him. She thought that she was going to go bring an offering, in which she realized that she was going to be blessed more than she even was able to give. And I think that's always what it is when we're, seeking God's wisdom. We think, God, I'm going to give you my life. And God's going, man, I'm going to give you so much more. I will do abundantly, exceedingly abundantly, what you can even ask, what you can even think. And when you're seeking wisdom and God's able to just give you more than you can even imagine. When you're seeking God's heart, he gives you more than you can ever give him. She's there, and I would imagine the way she's talking that we're going to see the Queen of Sheba in heaven. She came from a foreign land, had foreign gods. I think by the time she was done with this visit, she had converted to worshiping the Lord, the God of Solomon. I think that's true because what Jesus said of her in Luke chapter 11. Watch, and I read part of it to you, but watch, go to Luke chapter 11, verse 31. The queen of the south shall rise up in judgment with the men of this generation and condemn them. For she came from the utmost parts of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. Check this out. And behold, a greater than Solomon is here. You see, he's commending the queen of the south, which would have been the Queen of Sheba. She went through incredible inconveniences to go and hear the wisdom of Solomon, because she heard that Solomon was so wise. And Jesus is saying, look, she's going to be standing there and condemning you guys who heard God's word when Jesus was walking the earth. Someone greater than Solomon is right in your midst, and you won't even give him the time of day. You don't even have to travel across the country. He's standing right here in front of you, and you won't even listen to him. That's what Jesus was declaring to these that he was preaching to. That she's going to be a testimony against you. She's going to be part of, if this woman who made this long journey was changed by Solomon's words, how much more should you be changed from Jesus' words? That's what he was declaring to that generation. And it's vital, as you look at this passage, as you realize that, Israel had a mission. And Solomon was the height of that mission. What was the mission? That they would not only be a light to the world, but what all the nations would come to them to learn about God, to learn about God's presence, to learn about God's glory, about God's power. And here, finally, the temple's built. This incredible structure that was just a magnet to the nations of who God was. And so they're coming from far distances to come and travel there. So that they can declare God's wisdom, God's glory, God's presence, God's power. It doesn't stop here. Look at verse 13. This is cool. The weight of the gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold, besides what the traveling merchants and traders brought. And all the kings of Arabia, the governors of the country, brought gold and silver to Solomon. The king Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold. 600 shekels of hammered gold went into each shield. He made 300 shields of hammered gold. 300 shekels of gold went into each shield. The king put them in the house of forest of Lebanon. The king made great thrones of a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps with a footstool of gold, which were fastened to the throne. There were armrests on either side of the palace of the seat, the place of the seat, and 2 lions stood beside the armrest. 12 lions stood there, one on each side of the 6 steps. Nothing like it had been made for any other kingdom. All of Solomon's drinking vessels were gold. All of the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Watch this. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing in the days of Solomon. Isn't that incredible? Just, we don't use silver around here. We're not cheap. Everything gold, right? Gold plates, gold glasses, gold. Everything that he had, all the utensils, it was all gold. That's the kind of wealth. And what it was declaring is that, God's blessings were evident. It was in a physical sense. You see, much of the Old Testament, you're seeing in a physical presence. All of the battles and the wars, you would see it in a very tangible way. As we go into the New Testament, it becomes a spiritual. We don't fight flesh and blood. We fight principalities and powers and rulers of darkness. It's a spiritual war that's going on. We're still in war, just like they were in the Old Testament. It's just not a visible or a tangible one. It's a spiritual and an invisible one. And the blessings would be visible and tangible in the Old Testament. As we're in the New Testament, God's blessings, is beyond wealth of gold and silver. It's God's blessings of His grace and His favor and His presence and His wisdom that He provides you, which is more valuable than any gold or silver. And all of the world at this point is just standing there in awe. This is what happens when a nation has God in their presence, in their heart and obedience. They seen a tangible evidence of it all. So much gold they didn't even know what to do with the gold. For the king's ships, watch verse 21, went to Tarshish, and with the servants of Hiram, once every 3 years the merchant ships came bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. I guess when you got that much stuff, you're going, what else can we get? Give me an ape. A couple monkeys. We need some entertainment around here. It's got a couple zoos going. Let's do something else. We got everything. And they would come with ships. And it was King Solomon just kind of, with so much abundance because of God's favor, God's blessing. Verse 22, so King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. All the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. All the kings of the earth. And so Jerusalem, for the first time, becomes the center of the world. Everyone going, man, I want my time. I want my opportunity to sit and ask the questions of Solomon. I want to hear truth. Solomon becomes another type of Christ as Jesus is going to come back. He's going to reign with a rod of iron. His kingdom's going to be ruled with righteousness and justice. He's going to have all wisdom and knowledge and all, and everyone's going to be coming into this new Jerusalem, that's going to be established. And they're going to want to hear from Jesus's heart of what he declares. And so it's an amazing picture because finally, the promises that God had given Abraham have come to pass. Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua, all these guys were looking for this day, which would represent a greater day when God's going to establish his kingdom and he's going to be the king and he's going to reign with justice and righteousness and goodness. I don't know about you, I'm longing for that day. where it says the streets are going to be paved with gold. You're going to walk up and, man, I need some gold. I'm going to go chip some pavement. It's not going to have. It's going to be nothing. The value of it isn't going to even matter because you're going to be in the presence of God. And it's incredible because for the first time, the nation of Israel is fulfilling its destiny. It's interesting that let's get a little further before I go there. Look at verse 24. Each man brought his present, articles of silver and gold and garments and armor and spices and horses and mules at a set rate year by year. Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots, 12,000 horsemen whom he stationed in chariot cities and with the king of Jerusalem. And he reigned over all the kings from the river to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones. He made cedar trees as abundant as sycamores, which are in the lowland. And they brought horses to Solomon from Egypt and from all lands. Now, this incredible time, this incredible moment in history was the pinnacle of the nation of Israel's existence. People from everywhere, coming to hear Solomon. And it was really God fulfilling his purpose, that he would be able to declare to the Gentiles of his greatness and his goodness. It's interesting that Israel's mission fulfilled. The church has a different mission, though. We're not to build cathedrals and tell everybody, come to us. Jesus says that we're to go to all the nations and make disciples of them. Rather than come, it's go. Right? Rather than saying, come and see me, I've been given the commission to go out and share the good news with other nations, with other people groups, with any door that God opens. I'm excited. In about 6 weeks, I'm going to Sudan to go and be part of a conference. Or we're going to be sharing with all of the chaplains that are on the front lines. I mean, these guys have their life on the line every day. We have this opportunity to go and encourage them and strengthen them and pour God's word into them, and then be able to go visit some of the churches there in Sudan where these people are living in huts and living in just impoverished areas and dangerous areas, and that with just a group of us, about 10 pastors, are heading out there just to go and pour into them. It's part of the Great Commission. It's part of what you and I have been called to do. Is not just hoard it to ourselves. We're to go and proclaim it to the world. Well, some of my favorite trips, going into the jungles of Peru and encouraging the churches over there and pouring into them and trying to help support a work that's going on over there so that they can reach their communities. You see, guys, we've been called to go outside of our own four walls, outside of our own community. We start in Jerusalem, we go to Judea, to Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the world. That's what we've been called to do. Jerusalem was, hey, everyone come here. The church is, we got to go out there. And it starts in your Jerusalem. It starts in the little circle that God's put inside, around you. Your family, your friends, your neighbors, the people that, you work with, your co-workers, being able to just being a light to them, sharing with them when God opens the door, the good news that God's provided you, that He loves you, that He's forgiven you, that by the sacrifice of His Son, that you can have a relationship with Him. It was there in Matthew 28 and verse 18, Jesus said this, all authority has been given to me in heaven and in earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe the things that I commanded you. Watch this. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. I love that. Because you go and I'll be with you wherever you go. You go and proclaim me. You go and stand for me. Go and, just like Solomon was trying to share God's glory with the nations. You and I are to share God's glory, but rather than them coming to us, we're to go to them. The very last thing Jesus told the disciples in Acts chapter 1 before He ascends into heaven, He says, you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. You're to be witnesses for me. You're to go and declare what I've done in your life. You're to go and declare it to others. And you look at Israel fulfilling their purpose. The church, think about the first century church. They took that serious, didn't they? You think of these men like Paul and James and Peter and Barnabas and Timothy and Titus. They were reaching the world with this message, introducing them to the God that loves them. And Solomon here, at the height of Israel's existence is, bringing them all in so that they can experience God's presence as well. And then that last verse, not the last verse, but verse 28, the last part of the section where it says, and Solomon brought horses, or they brought horses to Solomon from Egypt. It was kind of like, first, don't accumulate wives, and don't go to Egypt to get your horses. Two things that God told him not to do, and Solomon did both of them. And it was the beginning of the end. Right, of the height. Because God can't bless disobedience. God can't take when someone's living a life of rebellion and go, well, how come God's not blessing me? Well, because you're not seeking Him. You really don't want Him to be the Lord of your life. You surrender to Him. You ask Him to take those vices and those things in your life that are separating you from Him. And man, you'll see God do great and mighty things. He'll change your desires. He'll change your heart. He'll give you a hunger for the things that He provides. Hunger for His Word, hunger to spend time with Him, hunger to grow in your knowledge of Him. You see, God's the one that provides those things, but you have to come and say, God, that's what I want. We come to the end of Solomon there in verse 29. He wraps it all up. And the rest of the acts of Solomon, the first, the last, they are not written in the books of Nathan the prophet. That's the earlier writings, Kings. In the prophecies of Ahijah, the Shulamite. And in the vision of Edo the seer concerning Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all of Israel for 40 years. And Solomon rested with his fathers. He was buried in the city of David, his father. And Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his place. We'll pick up with Rehoboam next week as we begin to see this deterioration. You know, you've seen Israel just kind of slowly being built up into this place where God was going to, do great and mighty things, and then you start to see the decline take place as they begin to get their eyes off of God, as they begin to, put their confidence in their wealth, in their treasures, in the temple. They start to think that it was something they did rather than something God did. You see, anytime we get our eyes off the Lord, man, it's the beginning of our demise. We're at the heights when we got our total, complete confidence in Him. That's when you're at your greatest moment in your life.